The seat that became a spotlight. They say the true test of character isn't how you treat the powerful, it's how you treat those you assume have none. This story doesn't begin with war stories or medals. It doesn't open in a battlefield or a courtroom. No, it begins somewhere far more ordinary, a boarding gate at Atlanta International Airport, where a routine flight to Washington, D.C. was moments from takeoff. No one knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Not the flight crew, not the passengers, and certainly not the sharply dressed woman in red heels who believed the world owed her something. But within the next 9 minutes, a confrontation over a seat would unravel layers of pride, reveal a quiet legacy, and bring an entire cabin to its feet. Not in anger, but in awe. And it all began with 5 simple, stinging words: "You're in my seat." The woman with the red heels, it began with the sharp staccato of red heels against the jet bridge floor, a sound that announced her arrival before her face ever did. Victoria Langston, dressed in a tailored navy blazer and clutching a Louis Vuitton carry-on, stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 482 with the air of someone who owned it. Her eyes locked on seat 1A, only to find it already occupied by an older man adjusting his jacket with quiet care. Without hesitation or greeting, she frowned and snapped, "Excuse me, that's my seat." The man, gray-haired, dark-skinned, with a worn U.S. Army cap resting in his lap, looked up slowly, puzzled but polite. "This here is 1A, right?" "Yes, and I paid for it," she said with a scoff, pulling out her phone to flash her digital boarding pass. Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the stillness like a blade. Other passengers froze mid-motion, some lowering their eyes, others pretending not to hear. But the tension had already claimed the cabin like a storm cloud. A soldier's quiet dignity, the man in the seat didn't raise his voice, nor did he flinch at the icy tone thrown his way. His name was Sergeant Thomas Garrett, retired, a veteran of 2 wars and a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, though you wouldn't know it from his modest appearance. He wore a simple brown jacket, slacks that had been pressed with care, and shoes polished to a mirror finish. "I believe there's been no mistake," he said gently, holding out his paper boarding pass, printed by hand at the gate by a kind attendant who had recognized the insignia on his jacket. "The airline said I was upgraded, didn't expect it, but they said it was an honor thing." Victoria barely glanced at the ticket, then rolled her eyes. "Well, I fly every week. You must have taken the wrong seat." Garrett nodded silently, offering no protest. There was no defiance in his posture, only quiet dignity, the kind forged in foxholes, not boardrooms. And though his body was weathered, the honor he carried made the plush leather seat seem like a throne, well earned. The Queen of the Skies, Victoria wasn't used to being told no. In her world of boardroom meetings, VIP lounges, and platinum reward tiers, status was everything. She flew first class not for comfort, but because it confirmed who she believed she was. That seat 1A wasn't just a place, it was a statement. She stood over Sergeant Garrett as though waiting for him to vanish. "I fly this airline every week," she repeated, louder this time, ensuring the nearby passengers heard her. "Everyone knows 1A is my usual." Her tone dripped with entitlement, the kind that expected doors to open, people to move, and explanations to follow her schedule. She wasn't angry, yet she was bewildered. Who was this man, and why hadn't he stood up already? But the old soldier remained seated, calm as ever. He'd faced bigger storms than this on lands far from home. And unlike Victoria, he didn't need to raise his voice to prove he belonged. Upgraded for honor, a flight attendant approached quickly, sensing the situation escalating. She was young, maybe late 20s, with a professional smile that flickered under pressure. "Is everything okay here? This gentleman is in my seat." Victoria huffed, waving her boarding pass like a badge. "First class, 1A, I always get 1A. The attendant glanced at her tablet, nodded softly, then turned to Garrett. "Yes, Mr. Garrett is in the correct seat, ma'am. He was upgraded at the gate by our staff." "Upgraded?" Victoria blinked, incredulous. "Why would they give my seat to—" The attendant gently cut her off. "Mr. Garrett is a decorated veteran. We honored his service with a complimentary upgrade. There it was, not an error, not a glitch, a decision." The cabin was silent again. Victoria's jaw tensed, the color rising in her cheeks, not from guilt, but from disbelief. Meanwhile, Garrett simply bowed his head, not with arrogance, but quiet humility, a man given no fanfare in war, finally acknowledged in peace. The unspoken divide Victoria sat in 1B, just inches from the man she had tried to displace. But the silence between them now stretched like a canyon, wide, deep, and uncomfortable. She crossed her legs, adjusted her blouse, and stared ahead with a look of forced composure, but the flicker of unease in her eyes betrayed her. Garrett remained still, hands gently folded, his posture impeccable despite the narrow seat. His army cap rested neatly in his lap. He didn't look at her, nor react to the tension lingering in the air like the stale scent of reheated coffee. Passengers around them pretended to mind their own business, though every whisper and glance was aimed toward row 1. Victoria had claimed power. Garrett had claimed grace. And yet, somehow, it was he who now commanded the space, not with words, not with status, but with the quiet weight of earned respect, the kind that doesn't require defending. Recognition from the sky in the cockpit. Captain Jason Reynolds scrolled through the brief flight notes when a knock came on the door. "Captain," a flight attendant whispered, "there was a small incident in first class. A woman thought the elderly gentleman in 1A was in her seat." Reynolds barely raised a brow, until she added, "Name's Thomas Garrett. Says he's a retired Army sergeant." The pilot froze. That name, Thomas Garrett, it wasn't just familiar, it was unforgettable. Years ago, during Reynolds' second tour in Afghanistan, he'd read the mission report of a high-risk rescue coordinated remotely under enemy fire. That mission saved Reynolds' entire crew, the lead strategist behind it. Sergeant Garrett, emotion gripped his chest. This wasn't just any passenger. Reynolds stood up, heart racing not with fear but purpose. "Tell ground we need to delay takeoff for a minute," he said firmly. "There's something I need to do before we leave this runway." The plane kept taxiing, but something far more important had taken flight. The unexpected halt. Passengers felt the engines hum lower as the plane slowed unexpectedly on the runway. Confused glances exchanged. A delay, a technical issue. Murmurs stirred in the cabin. Victoria looked around, irritated. First the seat drama, now this. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened. Out stepped the captain. Captain Reynolds walked with precision, his pilot's uniform pressed sharp, eyes scanning until they landed on the man in 1A. A soft smile crept onto his face. Everyone quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice calm but commanding, "before we take off, there's something I need to do." All eyes turned forward. Even Victoria, who had sunk lower in her seat, froze. He turned to Garrett. "Sir," he said, standing at attention, "you may not remember me, but years ago, your leadership during a mission in Afghanistan saved my life." Then, with all the respect of a soldier to his superior, he saluted. It was as if time paused. The hum of the engines, the rustling of papers, all went still. A cabin in awe, the cabin erupted into spontaneous applause. Some passengers stood. Others wiped at their eyes, moved by a gesture that reached far beyond a simple seat. Even the flight attendants paused their pre-flight checks, hands over hearts, honoring what they had just witnessed. Thomas Garrett blinked slowly, taken aback. He hadn't expected a moment like this. Not at his age, not in this way. He tried to stand, but the captain placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've already stood for all of us," he said softly. Victoria stared at the scene, a flush rising in her cheeks, not from pride but shame. Just minutes ago, she'd demanded he move, treated him like he was invisible. Now, in front of a full plane, he was the center of reverence. And she, the one who claimed superiority, was suddenly very small. What started as an argument over a seat had transformed into a lesson in humility, and every person in that cabin would remember it long after the wheels left the ground. The silent shift as the flight soared above the clouds, the energy in first class was no longer tense. It was reverent. Passengers stole glances at Garrett with newfound awe, their earlier indifference replaced with quiet respect. The man who once blended into the background now carried the weight of history in every wrinkle, every silent breath. Victoria hadn't said another word since the salute. Her posture was different, less rigid, less sure. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning not just her actions, but her assumptions. She turned slightly toward him, hesitant. "I didn't know," she murmured, almost ashamed. Garrett gave her a small, understanding nod. "Most people don't. That's all right." There was no malice in his voice, just the calm wisdom of a man who had seen worse and forgiven more. In that moment, Victoria realized that power wasn't in titles or seating charts. It was in grace. And the man beside her had it in spades. Legacy in the skies when Flight 482 touched down in Washington, D.C. No one rushed to the front. Instead, they waited as Garrett was gently helped to his feet. The captain came out once more, not to command but to escort. The crowd in the jet bridge parted for him like royalty. Outside, someone from the airline had arranged for a small honor guard, young veterans in uniform, saluting the man who had paved the way before them. Phones captured every second, and by the time Garrett's feet touched the terminal floor, the video of the captain's salute was already spreading online. But to Garrett, none of that mattered. What stayed with him was the applause. The salute and the silent apology from a woman who had learned a lesson in humanity at 30,000 feet. His journey had started in war zones, but on that flight, on that day, his service received the dignity it always deserved. Sometimes it only takes 9 minutes to change a perspective. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to earn that kind of silence. More than a moment by the time Sergeant Garrett disappeared into the sea of passengers in the terminal, the story had already taken flight online. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, it wasn't just a viral moment. It was a life lesson sealed in silence, humility, and the ripple of a single salute. Victoria Langston never forgot that flight. It would humble her in ways 1,000 keynote speeches never could. And though she would go on to sit in many more first-class seats, none would ever feel quite the same again. As for Garrett, he didn't seek attention or thanks. That brief moment of recognition was enough, a salute not just for him, but for every quiet hero the world had overlooked. Because sometimes the biggest stories aren't in headlines, they're tucked quietly in row 1A, waiting for someone to see them.